Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on a beautiful, bright spring day. You could have been doing a lot of things today, and we're happy that you decided to spend it with us. I think you won't be disappointed. It's going to be a great talk. So first thing I've been asked to ask you is if you have a cell phone with you to please put it on vibrate or silent, or give it to me and I'll keep it, but don't let it ring. We are recording, we've begun recording our lectures for posterity and for to share with the other people who are not able to make it, so cell phones are particularly disruptive for the recording. A few upcoming events that I will tell you about. I'm here in place of Tom Ryan. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephanie Townrow. I'm our Director of Education and Public Programs here. Tom regrets not being with you tonight. He's at another museum, if you can believe it, but it's not nearly as good as this museum, just having a trip. So the first event we have coming up soon is on Thursday, April 18th. We are going to be hosting the Edward Hand Medical Museum for their lecture, which is entitled Wampum is in Our Heart, Native American Medicine and Its European Reception in Penn's Woods. It's going to be a really interesting one. It's given by Dr. Marlene Arnold from Millersville. She will describe Indian theories of disease and healing practices in 18th century Pennsylvania. She'll talk about how Europeans at the time embraced Native American medical knowledge, which was recognized as extensive and sophisticated, and these Europeans actively sought Indian treatments. So it should be a really good one. Of course, you should all be aware that coming up very soon is the best holiday of the year, President Buchanan's birthday. He was born on April 23rd, and this year we're celebrating his birthday on Saturday, April 27th. It's his 228th birthday, and it will feature, of course, every year we do an annual presentation of the White House wreath at the president's grave site at Woodward Hill Cemetery. That's at 10 o'clock. From 11 to 1 this year, we're partnering with our friends at Madcap and Company on the 300 block of Queen Street downtown. They're celebrating Buchanan's birthday, and they're launching some Buchanan merchandise. And we'll be there with Mr. Buchanan and friends talking about history, and they have a raffle and cake, so it's going to be great. Then from 2 to 4, you can come back here if you're not tired of celebrating the birthday, come back here from 2 to 4. The children from Buchanan Elementary School get all dressed up, and they each learn a room in the mansion, and we offer free tours of the mansion led by these little children. It's very cute, and they leave every 15 minutes, the tours, and they're free for you, so you might want to see that. It's always adorable, and we have cake also, so if you didn't get it, you can have more cake. The last event I want to talk about is part of a new series we have with the Arboretum here. If you're curious about what's blooming and singing in the Arboretum in May, we have Lancaster Central Park naturalist Lisa Sanchez, and she'll do a little walk through the Arboretum and enjoy the sights and sounds of spring and talk about what's here during the spring. It's called Blooms and Birds, and it will take place on Saturday, May 4th at 10 a.m. And you can buy tickets on our website. They're $5 for adults and $3 for children, I think, so very reasonable. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce our speaker tonight. Beginning with Martha Jefferson Randolph, Thomas Jefferson's daughter, there have been a handful of what's called surrogate first ladies who have performed the duties of White House hostess while not being married to the president. Even when these women are acknowledged as surrogate first ladies, they're not often granted the value or respect of official first ladies, though many served in important roles in presidential administrations. Perhaps most notable to the lineup of surrogate first ladies, not really perhaps, we know it is Harriet Lane, the niece of President James Buchanan, who is the only woman who is not married to a president that is considered an official first lady, and she really was a first lady. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Katie A.S. Sibley. She's the director of the American Studies program at St. Joseph's University. Her most recent publication is a comprehensive monograph on Florence Harding entitled First Lady Florence Harding, Behind the Tragedy and Controversy. And it is a fascinating read. We hope to have her back sometime to talk about Florence. And she recently served as editor of a companion to First Ladies, which is a giant guide of about all the First Ladies. So she's really an expert. And I'm delighted to welcome Katie Sibley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that really warm welcome. And I got to have a tour earlier today of Wheatland, which is just such a treat. I hope you all, if you haven't done that, I recommend. The rooms are beautifully preserved and really, really a treat. Thank you so much for having me today. So today, as you've heard, we're going to explore the history of surrogate first ladies, those often overlooked but highly significant women who filled in when others were otherwise unavailable. And once, and only once, with the nation's first lady in the land, Harriet Lane, of course, for an entire administration. These women have indeed been long overlooked. They are thus not mentioned in this, oh yeah, don't even try to look too closely, but this is what's called the First Lady poll, and they do it every 4 years. There should be a more current one than this available, but I wasn't able to secure it for this lecture. I'm sorry. This is from 2014. But of course, the usual suspects are at the top, and I'm very sad to say that Florence is near the bottom. Jane Pierce, yeah, she's kind of sad too. In fact, you know what's interesting? A lot of these women who are at the bottom had surrogates, except not Florence. But guess who's missing? The surrogates themselves. Where is Harriet Lane on this list? She isn't there. Now that is an oversight. As you just heard from Stephanie, she was really herself, she was a fully fledged first lady, even if she was not married to Buchanan. Okay, so surrogacy. In fact, the man who put together this list, his name is Robert Watson. He polls different historians. He has pointed out, even though he doesn't count surrogate first ladies, that these surrogates, just by the necessity that they must be brought in, right, to serve this role, they suggest the importance of the first lady position in the social affairs of the presidency, her importance as a public figure, and the central role she fulfills in the management of the White House. So you can't not have someone, right? So the surrogates come in. So indeed, this existence of surrogates underlines that someone has to do the important work of administering the White House for the president. And as we'll see today, these women, and they have all so far been women, have not only filled in, but have also enhanced and developed the position in significant ways and remain some of our most memorable first ladies. Now, as you know, Americans expect the wife of the president to entertain, adopt causes, lobby, and consult their husband, the chief executive, all to varying degrees. Sometimes they're really almost 100% partners. Other times they're much more, kind of behind the scenes. But everything they do, or not do, has political salience, right? That's always kind of tied in with that. Now, one First Lady scholar, Nancy Young, wonderful author, has pointed out that we were born, as you know, in a revolution against a monarchy. However, we always have these kind of pseudo-royal elements, right, around our presidency, including the name Lady Washington, which was given to Martha Washington, kind of a royal-sounding name, and then, of course, the term First Lady, which we're all familiar with, and the expectation these women be hostesses, and that they have, a role, they're responsible for maybe problems in the nation. All this sort of underlines that royal theme, right? And when these wives are missing or non-existent, we have had to put someone in their place, and initially, this has been sort of a ceremonial role, but as we'll see, it becomes more substantial. So I jump in today, not with Harriet Lane, but with a couple of earlier ones, and then I go back and even trace us earlier than that. But of course, Harriet will be prominent, very prominent today, because why not? She is the one. She is the most important one. There's no question. So, but Molly Arthur McElroy, Mary here, but she really went by Molly. Maybe someone you're not familiar with. She arrived initially to help her widowed brother, Chester Arthur. You may recall he had to come in because Garfield had been shot and eventually died, very sadly. She came in to look after his daughter, Nellie, who was herself had no mother. Arthur was a widower. So she comes in to look after this young girl who's 10, this little girl, this orphan of, well, she was half an orphan, I guess. But as it turns out, she has a whole lot of other things to do because she's a surrogate first lady, right? She's not just a child care person. She needs to run parties. She needs to work to build the legacy of Arthur. And in fact, she did all of those things. So what's interesting about surrogate first ladies is not only do they enhance the position in some ways, as we'll see, especially with Harriet Lane, but they also can be a little creative with it. They can actually sometimes break away from some of the things that traditional first ladies did, as you will hear today. People loved her parties, Molly McElroy. One newspaper said, "What we may call the official hospitality of President Arthur's administration is without a flaw," including, especially perhaps this crowd I think would agree, her refusal to ban alcohol. Right? Now, some of her predecessors had done that, but not Molly. She wasn't going to do that. Her last reception was very popular. 3,000 people came to this reception, and there she is with her sister Malvina, who also sometimes helped out in the White House. Now, interestingly, along with this role with parties and helping Chester Arthur, she also kept his legacy alive. And now this is one thing that a lot of first ladies do, including surrogate first ladies, sending his papers to the Library of Congress to make sure they were preserved. A lot of papers got destroyed in this time. A lot of people just wanted to burn their papers. It's really sad. So for historians, this was great. She saved Chester Arthur's papers. I know you probably haven't thought about Chester Arthur for 1 second for the last 6 months, but now you'll see. This was significant. Yes. And indeed, he had a statue in Madison Square Park. It's still there. A lovely place to go if you're ever there around right by the Flatiron Building. His statue is right there. And in addition to that, they were a very progressive family, the Arthurs and the McElroys. In fact, Molly and her husband John later hosted Booker T. Washington at their house when he came to Albany to give a speech in 1900, one of the worst moments in race relations in this country. You know, they really pretty forward-thinking people. I could even say more about Arthur on that, but I won't because we have to get on with our first ladies. But you can be rest assured that they were, Arthur deserves a second look, I think. Now, from Molly McElroy, we go to another progressive woman, Rose Cleveland. She's our next surrogate. One sister succeeding another. First time, only time that's ever happened in the White House, right? So when Cleveland came in, he didn't have a wife. Not yet anyway, but he had a sister. And she was a fascinating woman. She was very much of an intellectual. She was an author. She wanted to edit a journal. He didn't want her to, but she decided she would anyway. But I don't think it worked out. But she did all kinds of things. And then that's not even the half of it, because she was involved encouraging women to get involved in science. She was part of this group called the Women's Anthropological Society in Washington. And then when Frankie and Grover were married, she was out of a job. She had to go find another place to live, and she found another lover as well. I don't know if she'd had a lover before, but this is a really very fascinating story. So Evangeline here, with her husband, who was about 34 years older, was kind of a, what you might say, kind of a beard or something. Evangeline and Rose were lovers, and they're married. They lived together. They didn't marry, of course, they couldn't at that time, but she was married already, as you can see, to the Reverend. But they ended up moving to Italy later after he died, and they did a lot of good helping people, sick people in Italy, etc. And they're buried together there. So Rose Cleveland is a fascinating woman, someone to study, an intellectual, someone who lived as a closeted lesbian, but certainly carried out her life as she liked, and was a great support to her brother, who then became, of course, married to one of the most popular first ladies, Frankie Cleveland. But let's go back now to some earlier surrogate first ladies. And in fact, I was introduced by Stephanie, who mentioned the role of Martha Jefferson in the White House, who supported her father. But we could also think about Dolly Madison, too, in that role, because Dolly Madison threw a lot of parties, as you may know, and even before she was First Lady, she helped Thomas Jefferson with his parties, because he was a widower, right? He had no wife since, I think she died in 1782, long before, right? Jefferson was in the White House. Now, she also helped to raise money for the Lewis and Clark exhibition. She did a ton of things, and she will have a role later in introducing another surrogate First Lady to her husband, which we will get to. And she, in fact, knew Harriet Lane. She lived in Washington till 1849 or so. She had long influence, Dolly Madison, in Washington. So let's look at the other surrogate First Lady of Jefferson, who came twice during the Jefferson administration. This is his daughter, Patsy. And what she would do when she came is she would, throw parties and kind of be, it was hard to have gatherings in the White House when there weren't any women there, because it was uncomfortable in some ways for the men to be all together. They'd often get in fights with each other. I don't know why this happened, but it did. So it's good to have some women there. So she would help him out. Now that's sort of a nasty cartoon over there, but I put it in just because it gives you a little sense of how she even gained some notoriety. She had kind of a difficult life, as you may know. Her husband was a pretty unpleasant fellow. He was an alcoholic, and she just had one baby after another. It was not easy. And in my companion, if you ever find it, it's too expensive to buy, but we can find it in a library. There's a lot of evidence in the chapter on her that probably one of her most intimate relationships was with her father. They wrote loving letters, and he was a pretty unhappy guy in the White House too. And so she supported him with these letters and, kind of bucked him up in tough times, because a very, very partisan moment when Jefferson was in the White House, as you may know. We ended up getting in a war with Britain and one thing after another. Now, perhaps actually there should have been even a third surrogate first lady in the White House, right? Because let's face it, this was the woman he had the closest relationship with after his wife had died. This, of course, is Sally Hemings, and I put up this is a rather complicated chart, but you can see it's really an interesting family line there, right? How their relationship and then her parents' relationship with others in the family. And this was known. I mean, this was noted at the time. The newspaper clipping shows you that. But for years, of course, it was denied by Monticello and other sources. But now it's been pretty much acknowledged with the DNA testing, et cetera. So she herself could have been perhaps also a surrogate first lady. Now, the next first lady who needed a surrogate was Elizabeth Monroe. Very interesting woman. Pardon me, just a minute. I'm going to have a sip of water. Now, this is her daughter, Eliza. So what happened to Elizabeth was she wasn't in very good health. This is very typical, as you'll see in the 19th century. There are a lot of ill first ladies. What was it about the White House? Was there something in the water? I don't know. Maybe there was some kind of disease. I mean, whatever it was, a lot of them were ill. And it's sort of sad, because what it means is we often dismiss a lot of these women. And in fact, there were, pretty interesting, a number of them. And especially their surrogates were particularly interesting, as you will see. So Eliza would often stand with Elizabeth. Elizabeth wasn't so completely debilitated that she couldn't, get out of bed, and they would stand together and do hostessing things and this and that. But what Eliza did was she decided that no longer, which Dolly Madison had done, were they going to go and visit everybody, all the diplomatic visitors. No, the diplomatic wives are going to have to come to them. They were going to have to come to the White House. Well, some people thought that was a bit much. Like, why wasn't Eliza going and knocking on their door? No. She said, you can come and see me right here. So that kind of infuriated some people. And then later, there was a wedding, the first White House wedding. This is this was Eliza's younger sister. She was 16 years younger, Maria, or maybe Mariah, married in the White House. And there was a very small list of invitees, maybe just not even as many people as in this room right now. People were pretty upset about that too. Well, what was wrong with Eliza? She was doing something else that they did not like at all. But so here you see, right, an example of a surrogate pushing new boundaries, deciding she's going to do things probably inspired by her mother. Remember that the Monroes had lived for a long time in France, and, they sort of were a little more maybe, aristocratic in their tastes. They brought in a lot of interesting furniture. In fact, they were very responsible for some of the look of the White House in some ways. We often think of Jackie Kennedy, who was, believe me, very important in that. But the Monroes also brought in a lot of French furniture and French antiques and things. And so I think they sort of had the sense that they were kind of special, aristocratic people, and maybe, people should come to them. But that didn't sit well with a lot of Americans at the time, as you might imagine. Well, so now a much different president will have a very bigger set of surrogates, and now we are getting to Andrew Jackson. Well, yes. So, well, there you can see. So Andrew Jackson, as you know, his poor wife, she died on the eve of the presidency. Part of it was due to the scathing commentary. You've probably heard these stories, right? There were rumors. There were rumors about their marriage, the marriage of Andrew and his wife, and this sense that in fact she had already been married to someone else. In fact, that marriage hadn't ended yet. Well, yes, it had, or hadn't it? Well, in any case, he fought duels over this, right? So when he runs for president, this all comes up again. And interestingly, she didn't know that it was coming up again, but then just before they came into the White House, it was, and I want you to just look at this because you can see how he needs a surrogate first lady. Cheese is only going to go so far, right? He's got to have a woman there to help serve the cheese, maybe. This was what he did. He opened up the White House and brought a lot of cheese. So poor Rachel Jackson, she dies. Look at the date, December 1828. He's already been elected. she dies on the cusp. Now, she wasn't in very good health, let's admit. This was not a surprise, perhaps. But it seems as she was pushed to this when she learned about these newspaper reports coming up again about her marriage, right? It was really a nasty thing. So she's gone, and he needs a surrogate first lady. So, of course, he turns to, as many did, his daughter-in-law. That was this larger picture here, Emily Donaldson. Emily Donaldson was married. It's complicated. I think she was married to her cousin, who was also his adopted child. Don't even try to figure that out. But yeah. But she served as a surrogate, and she was a very fine surrogate. You can see, though, that there's another woman here who comes in later because she died, sadly, tuberculosis, I think it was, toward the end. But there was a more important reason that she left, that they had to bring in another, well, that there was a gap, shall we say. So she comes in because, of course, Mrs. Jackson is dead. And then she doesn't stay that long as First Lady because of this business. Have you all heard of the Peggy Eaton affair? Well, now you have, okay? So what happens is this. So Peggy Eaton was married to John Eaton, who was the Secretary of War in the Jackson administration, okay? All right, you're with me so far. But unfortunately, just like with the Jacksons, okay, there was an issue with her earlier marriage. Had she actually been independent when she married Mr. Eaton, or had she still been married to John Timberlake? Anyway, one of those. Had they? It wasn't clear. Now, you can see in this picture that Jackson loved her. He liked Peggy Eaton. He thought she was great. He wanted her to come to all of his parties and eat all of his cheese. But the others, including Floride, if I'm pronouncing that right, Floride, Florida, anyway, Floride Calhoun, who was the wife of the vice president, and a number of other cabinet secretaries. And as it turns out, Jackson's own daughter-in-law, Rachel Donaldson, did not like Peggy Eaton at all. They thought she was a scandalous woman. And there was something going on at the time called the social whirl, where these women had a really important role around the cabinet, these wives, to kind of move themselves up and get, popular and known. And Peggy Eaton was like this like damaged goods there. I don't want to be associated with her. Poor Peggy. So, but Jackson stood by her because he knew what had happened to his wife. He knew about those nasty, scurrilous things. And he said, Peggy, you're okay with me. But in the end, Rachel just couldn't bear it. She was like, I am not having anything to do with this woman. So she went away for a while, but she came back because, as it turned out, the cabinet sort of reshuffled in the next administration, and Peggy Eaton the Eatons were no longer such an issue, so she could come back and be First Lady again. But it's a very interesting story, and later it was dramatized in this crazy movie called The Gorgeous Hussy, and you can see there is Peggy Eaton, and there is this is how they did paint, actually, the older Mrs. Jackson. They painted her that way as kind of in her own time, as sort of this rube, this country woman who did these sort of folksy things, like, I guess, smoke cigars or something. But poor Rachel, she suffered in so many ways, just so unfair. Well, in any case, so we have, with Jackson gone in 1837, guess what? We have another bachelor president. Time for another surrogate. But the problem is there isn't a surrogate available, because Martin Van Buren had only 4 sons. None of them were suited to be hostesses. I'm sorry, just wasn't going to work with these men. So the place was dour. None of them were even married, I guess, at the time. So not even their daughters-in-law of Martin Van Buren. One person complained the present incumbent, this is Van Buren, has no female relations to preside. You see how necessary it is, right, to have these women there, and seems to be so much absorbed in party politics that he will scarcely open the house to those who want to see it. This is obviously not the time of Jackson, right? Where's the cheese? I mean, come on, open the house, bring us in. But fortunately, by the next social season, the spring of 1838, thanks to none other than Dolly Madison, I told you she was going to come back, she introduced Angelica Singleton to Van Buren's son, Abraham. And they married, and soon we have a new surrogate first lady in the White House. So there's Martin, her father-in-law, and there is, how does he grow his hair like that? I mean, you have Buchanan like this, and you have him like this. I don't know. We don't seem to be able to do that today. Just great. All right. So this is the problem, though, with Angelica. She's a really interesting woman, a well-educated woman. She becomes enamored of, once again, the British and the French. She wants to bring a little, higher style to the White House. She goes on this European tour as part of her honeymoon with Abraham. She's very young. She's like 21 or 22. She returns and she says, the next reception, I'm going to be on a platform. it's going to be a tableau. I will be up there with these lovely ladies around me who all have ostrich feathers in our hair, and then everyone will admire us, and perhaps I'll look at them, but I won't shake hands, please, that's not fun, you know. So she painted herself as this sort of royal figure in this tableau, and I don't have a picture of it, but you can sort of get a sense of it in this, I think they're fake, but there she is in this sort of ostrich feathers or something. So this did not work so well for Van Buren at all in the 1840 election, as you might imagine, because people now figured that he was his first lady was a snob and he was outrageous, they thought. And of course, this is the moment, right, when people are all competing to, you know, to be sort of more genuine, more authentic, more rugged, more frontier than the other one, right? So the time of the log cabin and all of that. So here's what they said about Van Buren. Because of this sense that his daughter-in-law had set, right, of this sort of aristocratic term. And they even said, well, you're making the White House a palace, and you're up there on this throne. And the ironic thing was, of course, William Henry Harrison, his opponent, actually came from this very fine, almost looks like Wheatlands, this lovely plantation here, Berkeley Plantation. It was in Virginia. And as it turns out, Van Buren was the son of a tavern keeper. But this is what they said instead about him. Let Van from his coolers of silver drink wine and lounge on his cushioned settee. Our man, meaning Harrison, on a buckeye bench can recline. Content with hard cider is he, right? So you can see the hard cider man with the log cabin. Again, it's sort of like fake news, right? I mean, this was not Harrison. Harrison came from a nice house. He didn't come from this log cabin. But unfortunately, this did ruin the chances for Van Buren to be reelected. And you know, again, the surrogate first lady, right? She plays a really interesting role here. After this, she kind of disappeared from the scene. She started to have a lot of babies and got busy with that. And later, she would take care of Van Buren and his whole family at their house in upstate New York. A really interesting woman. Okay, so now Harrison, another one who needs a surrogate. So we just can't get away. That's one after another. Now, you know what happened to him. He died, right? In a month. You've all heard the story. 1 month. And his wife never showed up. She was going to come to Washington. There she is. But she never made it. Because she was going to come, I think, in May. And in those days, they started in March. And, you know, he was gone. He was gone by March. I mean, he's gone by April. A poor guy. So, but he did have a surrogate, though. He had his daughter-in-law fill in for that 1 month. I don't know if there were any parties or anything. Probably not a whole lot. But so it's again, it's sort of an ironic thing. And then we're going to have one more surrogate. I mean, they're just coming so thick and fast now. What happens is we have another sick first lady. In this case, it's Letitia Tyler, very ill. John Tyler's wife, she dies in the White House, and then he will remarry in the White House. I think it was probably the first White House wedding, even before Frankie Cleveland and Grover. Now, in between, though, he needed a first lady, and once again, a surrogate was called for. So who is this? Priscilla Cooper Tyler. Here she is. So she will serve during the years of Letitia's illness, and then after her death, basically about 3 years, because Tyler, you know, has most of the Harrison administration, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe's gone, now we got Tyler, right? And he marries, before he marries Julia, Priscilla is the surrogate first lady. And one scholar has talked about her as kind of really a very good example of the importance of the surrogate first lady, because she really was not just filling in. Priscilla was really key. She was a crucial player here, because remember, this is a very interesting time, right? This is when the United States is expanding. Texas is becoming independent, possibly becoming part of the United States. All this debates over slavery are going on. By the way, Julia, when she comes in, although she's from New York, is all pushing for Texas herself, and a very active diplomacy on that issue. But talking about Priscilla now, while she's the surrogate first lady, she was a young and vibrant woman, as you can see. She actually had been a Shakespearean actress. She was very, had really a style. And one of the advantages of being a surrogate is that you are choosing the job, right? I mean, she was his daughter-in-law. I guess she could have said no if she wanted. She wasn't married to Tyler. She was his daughter-in-law. She could then choose the job, and she could do with it what she liked, right? She could carry out some things that she might want to do. And moreover, she wasn't married to a stressed out man, the president, right? She was vibrant and healthy and happy and all of these things. So, and moreover, as a young woman, there was, as one historian has argued, she might even add a psychosexual dimension to the position of first lady, right? Because she's sort of this young, attractive woman who's in the midst of all this entertainment. So an interesting example of what first lady surrogates can do. Now, the next first lady to have a surrogate, I tell you, it just keeps coming, was of course, the very sad Jane Pierce, and you saw that she was at the bottom of the First Ladies. It's really not her fault. She had such a terrible time. Do you know what happened to her? She lost one of her children, and then on the way to the inauguration in 1853, I guess it was, she lost the second. They were in a horrible train accident on their way to Washington. The train went off the tracks. She and her husband lived. She grabbed her son. He was crushed. I mean, she was fine. He was dead. 12-year-old boy then. So very, very sad. Very sad. And then she finds out that her husband, who she's already suspicious of because he was a drinker and she didn't like that too much, he apparently had wanted to be elected, and she was not happy. She had thought, he had told her, well, I'm going along with it because, they want me. I got to do the right thing, And no, it turned out he wanted to be elected, so she was really vicious about that, viciously angry, dour, unhappy woman. So, of course, she needs a surrogate. And she brings in her Aunt Abigail, who helped out for a little bit there at the end of the Pierce administration. But it was a very sad time, very sad time. So, aren't you relieved that we are now finally getting to a happy time in the White House? Happy, joyful, nobody's sick, okay? Nobody's sick, nobody's dying. Well, actually, that's not true. There were some deaths. She lost a brother, a sister, then a brother. But still, despite that, our dear Harriet Lane was going to make a huge impact on this position of First Lady. Now, I thought this was a really interesting picture because it's one of the very earliest of photographs, probably one of the earliest that she appears in. There's Harriet Lane, I think you can see next to her uncle, James, and then Sarah Polk is in this picture as well, and Dolly Madison is even in the picture. So kind of an interesting mix of the three families there. So this is, if it had been perhaps a, let's see, so yeah. So if it had been perhaps a different time, right, perhaps, and again, I know we don't have a definitive answer on the status of Buchanan and Rufus King, but perhaps if it had been a different time, Vice President William Rufus King, who was Pierce's vice president and had lived for 20 years with Buchanan, I'm sure you've heard the stories, perhaps he could have been first partner, right, in the White House. But that didn't happen. He died soon after this, right? I think he died in 56 or 57, not too long after this. So as it turned out, he was not the first partner, but it was instead Harriet, of course. Harriet, who had been adopted by James as a young girl, and she was about 11 years old. She lost her parents, and he took her and another nephew and took them into his house to take care of them, where they would eventually live. She didn't move here until she was 18 because they lived somewhere else, but she certainly did spend quite a lot of time right here, Harriet Lane, especially after the White House years. Okay, so it's interesting about this because Buchanan, of course, never married, had no children, just had these young sort of wards. And as one historian wrote, although he was not particularly fond of children, he was attracted to this frank and handsome child from her earliest infancy. So she had actually chosen him to be her kind of guardian. She loved him, and he really loved her. And he knew, as a 19th century historian pointed out, perhaps he knew that she would be a fit advisor in difficulty, a sympathetic companion in sorrow, the light and ornament of his public life, and the comfort at last of his lonely hearth. I mean, she was really all those things. She was very, very close to him. But unfortunately, he was kind of controlling of her. She had some beaux. She had people who wanted to marry her, and he kind of got in the way of that for a long time. She didn't marry till she was 35, in part because he didn't always approve of these men. He told her when she was just 16, men are short-sighted and know not the consequences of their own actions. I should like nothing better than to see you well settled in life, but never think of marrying any man unless his moral habits are good and his business or his fortune will enable him to support you comfortably. Now, that's not bad advice, but it did sort of get in the way of her fun sometimes. Well, a few years later, a 43-year-old presidential child, one of the brothers of Abraham Van Buren, right, another Van Buren brother, was courting her. Of course, they were great disparity in age, but, could have worked maybe. Van Buren was kind of a fun guy, known for high living. I think Harriet might have enjoyed that, but her uncle said to her, he will be a rebellious nephew to him, I guess. So, nope, not the last time that the uncle would say, not going to marry that one. That's all right. Now, meanwhile, as a young woman, she goes, really a girl, she goes to school at this first Catholic school for girls in Washington, Georgetown Visitation Academy, where she learned horseback riding, and she also developed piano skills and other things. She became very cultured And this is important because she will soon be going to England and get to practice some of these cultural attributes. And she also became very strong and muscular. And this is important because you will see that she liked to show off her physique, and she had a good one because she was really quite strong. Now, off she goes to London in 1854 because her uncle was named the ambassador to the court of St. James. And so she's living in London at the time. And at this point, as a young woman, she's meeting a lot of interesting people who are there, including Nathaniel Hawthorne, who happens to be the consul, the sort of commercial representative, right, of the United States in Liverpool, while Buchanan is there working for the Pierce administration as our ambassador, what the time is probably called a minister or something like that. And so what happens is he meets her and he says, Mrs. Hawthorne, her gown was terribly low across the shoulders. Okay. But he did add that she was sensible, vivacious, and I'm not quite sure what this means, firm textured. Okay, so, whatever. I don't know. So yes, she was again, she was muscular. Now, she also managed to impress Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who just loved her interest in British literature, loved her writing abilities. And meanwhile, at the same time that she was there, they introduced her to some very interesting individuals, socially active individuals. Remember, this is time of reform in Britain. They're getting rid of the Corn Laws, and some changes are happening. There was a physician she met called Sir Henry Holland, who was conducting studies on the connection between mental and physical health. There was Margaret, the Dowager Duchess of Somerset, who helped underwrite rural housing projects. So she's basically meeting these reform-minded people, right? While she's there frolicking, having fun, of course, and maybe dating some of these British men. Her uncle saying, no. So she had a good time, but this social consciousness, just keep that in mind, because that's going to come back with her, and it really is. And remember how young she is. She's like 24, 25, and she's really open to learning about all of these things. Okay, so meanwhile, back in the States, right, 1856, there's a presidential election, and she will be very involved with this. At least, first he told her not to be too involved. She went back before he did from England, and she's like, shh, he tells her, keep it quiet. I don't want a lot of attention paid to you about any of my plans yet. But in the end, of course, he does run, and he is elected president. And in fact, even though there was a suggestion maybe that he was, by the way, briefly engaged, as I learned about today on my tour. But at one point, they were rumoring he was going to marry Sarah Polk because she was now widowed. Her husband had died of cholera, but no, he didn't marry her. He didn't marry anybody, as you know. And so his first lady is going to be this proud surrogate, the most shining exemplar of the genre, Harriet Lane, and this is understood to be her inaugural gown, and you're going to see this picture later. It kind of becomes like her celebrity picture. She hands it around to people, or hands it out to tourists, this kind of thing. She played on all those angles. She was quite aware of how to make herself more visible and connected. So there was a huge inauguration. It was a very, it's interesting to think about it, that this was a time of great strife in the country, right? A lot of divisiveness going on, but they managed to play it up and have a good time in Washington. There she is at the ball with her husband, sorry, I keep saying that, her uncle. And that is actually probably the first photograph of an inauguration ever taken. No, it's not a great photograph, but you can, kind of interesting to see that. There's one of the ball invitations. So she just had a blast. And they had 40,000 people show up to some of these events. And of course, they had a giant cheese. No, just kidding. No, they were, as we heard about earlier, they had a giant cake, okay? Because, of course, you guys do cake here, right? Cake, yes, much better. Cheese, please. It starts to smell, not good. So this giant cake was 4 feet high. It had flags from every state and territory in the Union. And Harriet, as one observer in the New York Herald said, was one lady in 10,000. She was just a star. She just was. So she really made everybody's day there. Now, she continues the fun, seeking to emulate Dolly Madison, of course, who she knew, to have some amazing parties, which she does, although her uncle complains a bit about the cost, of course, and he complains about the food and the decor and even the music. I think he didn't realize that she was trying to create like an intellectual environment. She wanted to bring people together who had lots to say to each other. She didn't focus so much on the food, but she liked to have a good time, and there was always plenty of wine and all of that kind of thing. In fact, as one observer noted, Washington was never gayer than when she was there, with sometimes 3 balls in an evening. Now, when her her father, I'm sorry, her uncle, got a little bit concerned about things and said, "There's too much fun going on here. You really have to stop." She started to have parties on the boat that was named in her honor. Wasn't that fun? Now, of course, he put a stop to that too. That guy was just he was a real spoilsport about some things. He was trying to be, he was trying to be a good steward of the country's money, but he was a lady a little bit too tight about all that stuff. So, in any case, she also feels some compunction not to overdo, because she knows that she's supposed to meet this kind of standard of Victorian womanhood, this sort of idea of this ideal woman who is respectful of norms and all this kind of thing. But still, she has quite a bit of fun even so. And one of the things she does is she sends messages back and forth to her friends back in Pennsylvania when Buchanan insisted on butter from Lancaster. I don't know, must be something about your butter here. Is it special butter? He had to have it. So it would go back and forth in this little butter kettle. And so she made a little key that no one could open except her and her friend. I think it was Sophie Plitt or someone back at, yeah. And so Sophie would send her messages, gossip back and forth. They had a lot of fun. And all hidden in the butter kettle. Must have gotten a little greasy after a while, but there it was. And the other place she hung out and got a little respite and maybe brought her wine was the White House greenhouses, which had just sort of been built, and beautiful new opportunity for her to go and hide out and have a little fun, which is what she did. She had a number of beaux, as I said. People were interested in her, but once again, her uncle, Nunk as she called him, said, "I wish now to give you a caution. Never allow your affections to become interested or engage yourself to any person without my previous advice." Okay, so he's still playing kind of this controlling role in her life. But as you can see, she managed to kind of make herself visible and get out there. And by the way, I learned about this, and I was trying to wear something kind of to remind you of it. I don't know if I succeeded, but it's called a bertha. Is that funny? I think it comes from a French term, berte or something, which has to do with this neckwear. So she, if you can see here, she showed off her shoulders. She was muscular and strong. She was an unusual woman for the time, right? Not all. You sometimes think of Victorian women as being kind of closed in or shy or very concerned about being sexual in any way. But she really was. She enjoyed being out there with her physicality, and she was quite a celebrity, as you can see, which is something I love to learn about, because Florence Harding also was a celebrity first lady, and here we have one who was as well. Now, I keep bringing up this issue of wine in the White House, and I don't want you to think she was a lush, although if you go to Wheatland's, you will learn that her uncle did drink quite a bit, I guess, right? So, of course, he couldn't stop her from enjoying. But she was concerned about alcohol, at least in one front, and that was with the Native Americans. There was an Indian agent, a man who worked for the U.S. government, and he was working with the Chippewa Indians in Wisconsin, and he was plying them with alcohol, which, as you may know, is a really bad thing to do, kind of undermining their morale, etc. And she stepped in, and she put a stop to it when she heard about it, and she got a letter from one of the Native American chiefs thanking her and calling her the mother of the Indians. So there's an example, right, of a surrogate first lady who's a reformer, right, someone who's looking out for the problems in society and wanting to correct them. So I think a really interesting piece about this. I mean, she really did take seriously this position. I know I've made her sound like kind of a flirt and frivolous, but not at all. I mean, part of that, yes, of course, but she's a young woman. She should have some fun. But she also took seriously her position as First Lady. And one of the pieces, especially at that time when the country was literally falling apart, right? I mean, this is on the cusp of the Civil War. The idea of kind of nation building, of trying to build the nation that was crumbling. So one of the parts that comes into that is in 1860, there's a visit from a Japanese delegation, the first visit from the Japanese here for a treaty with the U.S. government, and she was there. She was the first woman to meet a foreign delegation in this way, and of course they collected some beautiful gifts, and one of these gifts, of course, is sitting in the museum here. You may have seen it, and also a number of other gifts, which in a way kind of disappointed her. She wasn't allowed to keep all of them, because apparently Buchanan, once again, in his sort of parsimonious, moralistic way, said, no, not right for us to keep these things. So there she is looking longingly at some of the silks that had come, I guess, or some of the other things that came in from this visit. So she also, very interestingly, in this era, another foreign visitor came, the Prince of Wales, okay, the child of Victoria and Albert, who she had met just a few years before, and they had a great time together. They went to Mount Vernon for a special visit, and they also went bowling, and here's what he said about her in that bowling episode. He said, "She outbowled me and put his muscle to shame." Oh, so, she was a strong and just lusty, vigorous woman, really she was. Now, indeed, such was her celebrity, and I know you've been waiting for this moment. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper called her first lady in the land. And according to historians, she was the first lady. And again, remember, she was only a surrogate, the first lady to get that name while in office. And the earlier people had called Dolly Madison a first lady, but not while she was first lady back in the earlier part of the 19th century. But you can see that with this woman here, with her exemplification of good taste, Victorian womanhood, healthy activity, excellent hostessing, political partnering with her uncle, you can see she really does exemplify this position of first lady. Now, one issue, though, that she certainly could have mobilized herself about a little bit more, although it would have been difficult given Buchanan's refusal to really act on it, was over the issue of slavery, of course, and the impending conflagration stemming from the North-South differences that were going on. And this is obviously going to explode before he even leaves office, right? After Lincoln's election, a number of states begin to leave, and then they continue to leave until the next spring. So her way of coping with these issues was she would set people up at the dinners in the White House, trying not to get, a Confederate next to a Yankee, or of course they weren't Confederates yet, but you know what I mean. She tried to kind of balance things as best she could. And one wife of an Alabama senator recorded that Harriet Lane, quote, served to keep the surface of society in Washington serene and smiling, though the fires of a volcano raged in the under-political world, as they absolutely did, right? So one can understand her desire to keep things smooth and flowing in Washington. We can also say, well, maybe it wasn't good to keep things smooth when things were really going downhill. Now, she did have one difference with her uncle on this issue. I love this cartoon here. It really does exemplify him very well. If you can see, he's trying to make a balance on the Mason-Dixon line, right? Yeah. And again, this sort of idea of the physical exploits there. So they both thought that slavery was going to kind of die of its own weight, just in time. That's all it needed. Now, his view was that it should be only voluntarily ended, and that it would end, at some point. But she thought, well, at least we should legislatively phase it in. But again, they both kind of on time to take care of it. It wasn't really a realistic or even a very moral position in so many ways. So now, once the secession begins to happen, Harriet does reach out to cabinet secretaries, urging them not to leave. Both she and Buchanan, of course, were loyal to the Union. But it was, I think this is one of the reasons why he is probably one of our worst rated presidents. But I don't know if we can hold that against her so much, right? What could she necessarily do? But something we can maybe talk about in the questions there. But certainly as a first lady, surrogate first lady, or not surrogate first lady, she is an exemplar of a first lady in so many ways. And we can certainly, I think, reckon with that. And one of the things that she does now, as we're leaving the White House in 1861, is she has a whole other life, right? She's going to finally get married at last. He's not going to say no. This is to a man called Henry Elliott Johnston, who she had met at this beautiful resort. I just couldn't believe that pool. I just want to go in it, don't you? And apparently, I don't know. I don't think it was there then, but maybe there was something like it. Was it? Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, it's gorgeous. So this is her. He's standing behind her here in this picture. And they met when they were teenagers, but because of all the other things that she did in her life and, various complications, they didn't marry until they kind of reconnected after coming back to Wheatlands here. She met him in Baltimore. He was a banker in Baltimore at this time, and they finally fell fully in love and had two beautiful boys, very sadly, two beautiful boys who did not live. The first one died in 1881, and the next one died in 1882. They were both about 12. They died of rheumatic fever, and then, of course, her husband dies in 1884. So it's really a sad situation here. But before, as that is happening, she decides that she's going to turn her wealth to help children. I mean, kind of makes sense, right? She had lost her children. So she builds something called the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children of Baltimore City, and it served all the needy children there. This building no longer exists, sadly. It was raised in 1974, but this was really a pediatric institution of great renown, and it lasted for many, many decades. She also moved to Washington. She kind of, decided it was a little, maybe, I don't want to say dull here, that might offend you. But anyway, she decided she was going to go and kind of live an interesting life because she was very much into collecting art at this point. She got involved with the St. Albans School Choir. She had a lot of interest. So she decided she's going to go to Washington. She lived with her cousin, May Kennedy, and she continues her philanthropy there. Now, she died in 1903. Here she is, looking elegant in that phase of her life. She died in 1903, but she was very wealthy, right? Because of her banker husband and other things that she, I guess, invested. She gave $400,000 to Johns Hopkins for this pediatric work that she had already been involved in. And if any of you here are a pediatrician or know a pediatrician, you will certainly have heard of the Harriet Lane book. And isn't it amazing? I mean, all these years later, it is still in print. It's like in its umpteenth edition. And it is a guide for pediatricians and people who work with young children and their health. Now, this is just another example. Now, she didn't write this book, but she made it possible, right, by her donations and her care and her interest. And this is a fascinating story. I mean, again, a reason why she should be remembered and not forgotten, as unfortunately she has too often been. Now, a couple of other things that she did in legacy building. She was also instrumental in making sure that her uncle's life was remembered by finding a proper historian. The first one kind of dropped the ball. She found a George Tickner Curtis who wrote this, I think, 2-volume biography, which very important, right? Because it meant that all his papers were preserved. The biography was written, unlike a lot of other, including Florence Harding, sadly, who tried to write her own. It didn't really work out so well. So then all the rumors and scandal mongering happened. And, thinking forwardly, like Harriet did, she made sure that a proper historian was in charge and that this was preserved. Unfortunately, her own papers, very few of them survived, sadly. She also was instrumental in making sure the statue was built in honor of Buchanan. So she was a legacy builder, right? She was a legacy builder, which is a really important role for a lot of first ladies. Think of Nancy Reagan. Think of Lucretia Garfield. They all, many of them did this to make sure that their husbands' lives and memories, or uncles in this case, were remembered. And of course, there was another ship named after her. Now, I think her ghost may party on that ship now. I don't know, but there it is. She is still remembered by our Coast Guard. Now, there's just a couple of other first lady surrogates I want to mention. This was Andrew Johnson's daughter, who covered for him because his wife was very ill, Eliza. She was the first senator. She was sort of the first, the first daughter, as opposed to daughter-in-law, to take on this role. And then there was another, Margaret Wilson. Sorry, when Ellen Wilson died in the White House, this is really the only example in the 20th century. When Ellen Wilson died in the White House of Bright's disease, her daughter helped out briefly, but then, he married, right? Woodrow Wilson remarried Edith. And of course, Edith was kind of a surrogate president, wasn't she? So that's another kind of surrogate. Yeah. Doesn't she look like, she just looks like that. I mean, you can see Wilson is behind her there. He's actually still out of bed. He's actually, before he fell into this mode of being in bed for much of the rest of the presidency. And there she is, leading him, as she often did. Okay, nothing wrong with that, except she wasn't elected. So there is something wrong with that. But anyway, yeah. So now, we might have thought we were going to have a surrogate first lady recently, right? Did you remember hearing about this? We thought that Ivanka Trump was going to be the first lady, didn't we? Kind of, that Melania, because she didn't go in. I mean, she outdid Mrs. Harrison. She didn't come in the first month. She didn't come in the first 6 months, right? She stayed behind with Aaron, her son. But, eventually she did come, and I don't think Ivanka Trump has become a surrogate first lady, and Melania has a number of activities that she's doing, although she's not as active, of course, as many first ladies have been recently. But I thought it was interesting. There was a sense it was going to be another surrogate, but that didn't happen. So, as this lecture has suggested, surrogate first ladies have not only confirmed the importance of the position of first lady, they have also stretched and enhanced that position for their successors. So it's high time they got in that survey, don't you think? Yeah. Including, I would say, being named and embodying the name that has graced all first ladies since, right? First off, making Harriet Lane and that name that has gone on from her, first lady in the land. Now, even in this age of first partners, right? The new governor's wife of California is calling herself first partner, not first lady of California, and I believe so is the partner of the governor of Colorado, calling himself first, or maybe first doctor. I don't know, but anyway, that's that family there. I think certainly we need to think about these surrogates as very significant in the list of first ladies, right? So just as some first ladies flew on the stars, presidents need their surrogates. Thank you so much for your attention.